Hey team, we're going to learn how we can keep content up to date and refreshed from a headless source like a headless CMS using Next.js Incremental Static Regeneration or ISR and the Revalidate tool. I'm Colby Fayok, and if this is your first time here, make sure you hit subscribe and click that little notification bell for future web dev content. Next.js is a React framework that gives you a lot of tools to really boost your productivity for building web apps. Now, one of the cool things is it gives you a lot of options for how you build and deliver those applications like SSG or static generation and SSR, which is server-side rendering, but it also offers a hybrid approach called incremental static regeneration, where you can ultimately deliver the files statically, but Next.js will have a background process that'll update those based on the cache policy that you define. Now, if this is your first time hearing of the term headless CMS or headless source, it's basically a decoupled system where in traditional cases like WordPress, you have both the front end and the back end working together on the same server, delivering all the same kind of things, where a headless approach, you have your server or wherever that you're managing your content, and this could be multiple locations, where you pull in that data into the front end of your application, decoupling them so you have a lot more flexibility for how you build the front end of that app. Now, I did mention that WordPress is a traditional means where you have one server with the front end and back end, but the cool thing is we can actually use WordPress headlessly, which is what we'll do inside of this tutorial. Now, we're not going to get too deep into this. You can check out my other video, which I'll link to above, where you can learn how you can build a Next.js application with WP GraphQL, which gives you a GraphQL interface for your WordPress data. But today, we're just going to use a simple Next.js starter that I created to let us dive right in and see how this works. But before we dive in right away, let's actually take a look at incremental static regeneration quick so we have a little bit of an idea of how it works in our mind before trying to code. Now, the implementation is actually relatively simple, but to try to illustrate how this works, we have our getStaticProps function, which is how we grab our data and pass it as props into our application. Now, the problem is that's only going to happen during the build time if we're using SSG or static generation. So to solve this, we have our Revalidate prop, which is going to provide that ISR or incremental static regeneration tool so that we can say anytime 10 seconds has passed, when a request comes in, we're saying, Next.js, we want you to go back in the background and fetch the new content for us to make sure we have all of our recent changes within that time period that we define. The cool thing is this works for paths too. So if we have our getStaticPaths, which is how we define what routes we want Next.js to build out for us, if we don't have that defined, we can define our fallback as blocking, meaning Next.js will render it during that initial request to make sure that user gets that path, and then everybody from there on will get the actual statically generated page. Now, to illustrate this a little further, just because I want to make sure you kind of have your head wrapped around this, if we define our revalidate property as 10, that means we're defining it as 10 seconds. So anytime a user visits this page, if it's under 10 seconds, it's going to get that existing static file. And that might be the build file if you've never used a refresh at that point. But if it's over 10 seconds, that very first request, or maybe a couple of requests until it's generated, will get that existing static file. Again, it could be that build file. But after that, Next.js in the background is going to regenerate that new file so that anybody after that new file is generated are going to get the new updated content so we can make sure it's delivering as fresh as we can. So diving in, we're going to use this Next.js WP GraphQL basic starter that I created, which is really just going to give us a really basic existing project that uses WordPress headlessly that we can kind of see how this is going to work in practice. If you want to follow along with your own WordPress instance, feel free to grab this. It's going to be in the description, or you can really use any headless source as you want. So to start, I'm going to grab this yarn command. I'm going to paste it into my terminal, and I'm also going to append another little string called my WordPress refresh content. It's probably a little too long, but what that's going to do is it's going to define my project name. Now, what's going to happen in the background is Next.js is going to first pull down this project from GitHub. It's going to clone it locally. It's going to install all the dependencies that are needed for that project, and it's going to reset Git history so that we have a great starting point for building our new application. But once it's ready, we're going to cd into that new directory. And once we're inside, we have one more thing to do, and that's add that .env local file to the root of our project, as well as this environment variable. So I'm going to go ahead and open that up inside of my VS Code editor. And in the root of my project, I'm going to create that new .env.local, paste in that environment variable, and the only thing we need to do is replace our endpoint. Now, inside of WordPress, make sure you first have the WP GraphQL extension installed. But once you do, all we need to do is grab our host from that blog, where we can go back into our editor and we're going to make sure our endpoint is available at our host/GraphQL or whatever you define that endpoint to be for your WordPress instance. But now we can run yarn dev inside of the root of our project since it's configured, and it's going to create a development server for us where we can open that up inside of our browser, where we can see that it's loaded, it's pulled in all of the content from WordPress, where we can see I pretty much have a clone of spacejelly.dev. The only thing I did is we can see that I was already testing this revalidation, but we're going to add more posts to see how it works, and we can make sure that we're following along. So now that we have our blog up and running, what we ultimately want to do is we want to be able to make sure that anytime that we're inside of one of our posts, anytime we edit that content, that it's going to refresh automatically for us so that when a new user comes in, they're going to get that fresh content. Now to start off, how about let's update the title of this one blog post and see how it works. Now before I do, instead of running the development server, I'm going to actually run a build of my current project, and I'm going to serve it or start it so that it's serving what would actually be kind of similar to what we would see in production. So the first thing I'm going to run is yarn run next build, which it's going to go through and use Next.js to build my project. Luckily, it's not a huge project, so it shouldn't take very long. But once that's done, we can start a local development server that'll point to that build instead of a particularly development build of it, so that we can make sure we're testing this as we would expect it to work. But now once that's done, I can run yarn next start, and that's going to do what I was saying. It's going to open up my development server. And now if I refresh the page, it's going to look exactly the same, but this time it's generating from a static file that was created during build. So now let's see what happens if I go over to my WordPress site, I head over to my posts, and once I'm there, I'm going to be able to scroll down and find that blog post title. And how about for now, let's get rid of the how-to in front of it. How about I want to change all of my blog posts to not have the how-to in front of it. So I'm going to remove that. I'm going to click update. And if we actually go into the GraphQL API, we would be able to see that this is now giving us the updated data without the how-to in front of the title. But if I head over to my build of the site and I try to refresh, we can see that nothing's changing. We don't have that fresh content. And that's because when the content was pulled in, it was at build time. So we're not going to get that fresh content. So that's where the ISR or revalidation comes in. So inside of my code, I'm going to go to source, pages, and I'm going to go to post slug, where again, if you're following along, this will be whatever file you're using to generate your particular page. But if I scroll all the way down to the bottom, we're going to see my getStaticProps, and we're going to see my getStaticPaths. Now we're particularly interested in getStaticProps, where this is going to be where we define that revalidate property. So inside of the return statement, we have our props, but in addition to that, and make sure it's at the same level of props, we're going to say revalidate, and let's for now set that as 10 seconds so that we can test what that looks like. Now, one small caveat to how we're actually doing this in the tutorial, we're using the Apollo client, which provides a caching mechanism. So I'm going to disable that caching mechanism by going to Apollo inside of this, if I spell it right, and inside of here, I'm going to actually disable this caching mechanism. Now I'm going to paste this into the client as a new property where I'm going to set the new default app options to have the no cache. And this is something I grabbed from the Apollo documentation to learn how to do this. But what this is going to do is it's going to tell Apollo it doesn't want to cache the requests that I'm actually making inside of the application. Now, the reason why we want to do this is if we have the Apollo caching layer and the Next.js caching layer, they'll both work independently. And that gives us a little bit of unpredictability. And just for the tutorial's sake, we want to have that predictability so that we make sure that it's working properly. Now, if you have a production application, you definitely would want to make sure you have the different caching layers, but you want to have an idea of how they work so you can fully expect what that minimum cache time or what that maximum cache time will look like. But for now, just so that we can see how this works in practice, I'm disabling the cache, and later when I have my production application, I can re-enable it. But now that I have that revalidate property, I'm going to head back to my terminal. I'm going to run build again so that we can pull in that new property that I set. But once it's done, we can run yarn start again, yarn run next start, so that we can start that development server. And if we go back to the page, we can refresh and we can see that it's updated. Now the twist here is it updated because we ran a build, not because of the revalidate property. So we want to be able to see how it's going to work with the actual revalidate property. Now, if I go back to my WordPress instance, how about let's remove automatically this time, and I'm going to update it. And if I was in the API, it would show it. The first time I refresh, it's going to show the same thing. Refresh again, and we can see that it's changed. Now, because we set such a small time, that 10 seconds, it's going to be hard to actually try to see getting it cached frequently. But as we can see, that first request that came in is still going to give me that original file. But the next time, because Next.js was generating it in the background, it gave me that updated content. So let's try this out a different way. Let's increase the cache time so that we can see what it looks like in practice. And I'll set that to 60 seconds. And again, we're going to need to rebuild. So I'm going to head to my terminal. I'm going to run yarn build, and I'm going to run yarn start. And if we refresh the page, we're going to get the same thing because we made no changes. But let's change it again. So I'm going to remove optimize. And of course, we know what this title is, just our development server. But I'm going to start refreshing. And I'm going to keep refreshing. And while I might hit that point in time, it's a much larger gap because I had the 60 seconds. And we can see no matter how many times I refresh, I don't know if you can see the spinner in the top of the tab, it's not going to actually update that content. But if I wait 60 seconds, which pause, I'm going to wait 60 seconds. Now, 60 seconds later, the first time I refresh this page, it's going to give me the old content. Remember, it's going to first give you that old content, but refresh in the background. But now if I refresh again, we can see that it was now updated because it was revalidating in the background. Now this is working with an existing post. What if I want to try and see how this looks with a new post? So if I go back to my WordPress tab and I'm going to hit add new post, and as soon as it loads, I'm going to say adding a new post, testing this out. And if I hit publish, as we know before, it's going to be immediately available inside of the actual GraphQL API. But if I take this slug, let me chop this up, adding a new post, and I actually try to go to it inside of my application, we're going to see we're going to get a 404. And this is going to be the case no matter how long I wait, whether it's 60 seconds, an entire day. If I don't trigger a new build, this is what I'm going to get. Now, the cool thing is we can fix this so that anytime somebody hits that page, it's going to actually refresh and create a new page for us. So inside of our code, we can see that we first updated our getStaticProps. Now we want to go to getStaticPaths, and we want to tell Next.js, instead of having a fallback of false, which means it's just going to throw a 404, we want to set it to blocking, meaning if somebody actually tries to hit this route and it doesn't exist, Next.js will block the request and it'll try to generate that page and return it so that they're going to wait the first time that's loaded rather than actually having to get an error or something or wait for it in the background. Now again, we need to stop our server. We need to run build first. And then again, we can run our start command, which will give us our local development server. And then I'm going to refresh the page. And as we would expect, we see that post, but that's because it was actually created during build. But let's head back to WordPress. I'm going to go back to the post pages again, and I'm going to click add new post. And let's say for this one, as soon as it loads, adding yet another post. And I can just leave most of my typos there. And again. So I'm going to click publish. And like I did before, I'm going to grab the slug out of that URL so that I can append it to this URL. And again, the last time we did this, we got a 404 right away, but let's see what happens this time, where if I hit that page, we can see that it took a little bit longer to load than usual, but that's because Next.js was generating that page in the background for us. But we can see we have that typo ridden title and again. Now, better yet, this is also subject to the same revalidation field or tools that we added to getStaticProps. So if we try to edit the page content or my typos, it should update. So if I go back and I'm going to change the lowercase d, the lowercase t, and how about I say yet again, I'm going to click update. And while we don't get that refresh right away, if I try to refresh, let's wait 60 seconds. And 60 seconds later, I'll do that first refresh, which doesn't give me updated content, but I'll give another one and we can see that I have none of those typos and I have my yet again. So this is great and it's working well, but let's take this one step further. What if we want to trigger these updates on demand? Next.js gives us the ability to create an endpoint and use an actual method to trigger a revalidation on on our site. So the way that this is going to work is we're going to create a new API file where inside of that, we're going to define first a secret just to make sure that we have authentication to actually do this. We're going to then use the Revalidate tool on the response object, and then we're going to finally make sure that we can hit that and do so dynamically. Now to start, I'm going to pretty much copy and paste this, but I'm going to make some tweaks inside of the actual code. So to start, let's copy this. This is from the Next.js ISR documentation. I'll put this in the description of the video. But inside of my code under source pages, I'm going to create a directory called API and then a file called revalidate.js. And inside, I'm going to paste that code. First, I'm going to get rid of all these comments just so that's a little bit easier to see. And we can see if we walk through the flow of what's happening. The first thing we're going to do is our application is going to check to see if the secret token exists. And it's going to make sure that it's the same token. If it doesn't, it's going to say that it's unauthorized. Now, if it is authorized, it's going to next use that revalidate tool. Now, currently, that's just a static value inside of there. So one way we can improve this is we can make it a dynamic value. So I'm going to say rec, and then instead of the secret, I'm going to say rec.query.path. That way we can say we want our path to equal whatever that is. But now we can pass that in as our variables. And if we save this and we restart the server, we're going to now have that API that we can hit. The last thing we need to do though is make sure we set that secret token. Now we already have our .env.local file, which is where we set our GraphQL endpoint. All we need to do is set that token so that we can include that in the URL. Now, generally, make sure this is a secure token. I recommend creating a randomly generated value so that somebody can't guess what that is, but that way it's going to give us a little bit of authentication to make sure we know where those revalidation requests are coming from. But now in my terminal, I'm going to run that yarn build command again, and then we can run yarn start, which is going to give us yet again our development server. And if we go to our browser and I go to my site, nothing should change at this point in time. But if I start to go to that local development server, and I go to /API/revalidate, and I start to enter in the values such as path equals, I'll enter a path in a second, and my secret is equal to 1234. We want to add that path value, and how about we test it for this one that we're looking at, the adding yet another post. So I'm going to paste that in for the path field. But what we can see is we have our API, we're hitting the revalidate route, we're setting a path in our query parameters as that path that we want to revalidate. And then we have our secret, which is going to be our value that we set inside of our environment variables. Again, make sure that's a secret and actually a secure value, something randomly generated and usually pretty long. But if we hit that, we can see that in the background, Next.js is going to actually run that revalidation, and we can see that it was successful because what we did in that response that we copied from Next.js from the documentation is we returned this JSON of revalidated is true. So let's actually see this in practice. So if I head to my post page, we can see that it looks just the same as we saw just a second ago, but let's head over to WordPress and let's say adding another post edit, and we can say editing this post to see on-demand revalidation. Now, if I hit update, we can see that if I start to refresh the page, nothing's updated. Now this time, we're not going to wait 60 seconds. I'm going to hit this endpoint, which is my revalidation endpoint. I see revalidated is true, and I refresh the page and I have my changes. That way I can do this programmatically for wherever I want, whether it's just hitting it like I did now, or maybe a GitHub action where I can tell GitHub to hit this request anytime I want, or if it's a deploy hook, if I make changes in my headless CMS, really the sky's the limit. I can do this programmatically for however I need to for my application. But generally, it's awesome how we have a lot of tools to be able to deliver those files statically, giving us the performance boost that we so desire while being able to keep our content fresh and have the flexibility to keep it fresh as we need it for our personal goals. Next.js has a lot of awesome capabilities, and this just even furthers it with incremental static regeneration, where we have the ability to deliver those performant applications and keep it fresh at the same time. What's your favorite use case, or how do you wrap your head around caching policies? Between the Apollo layer, the Next.js invalidation, and maybe even caching from the API itself, how do you try to organize those things? Let me know in the comments. If you want to learn more about headless WordPress and Next.js with my actual starter that gives you a ton more features than just that basic one, check out my video Next.js with headless WordPress, where I teach you about those GraphQL queries, WP GraphQL, and how we can actually deploy that to Netlify. Or if you want to learn more about the difference between the static and dynamic routes and everything that goes into page and fetching data creation inside of Next.js, check out my video, Create Pages and Fetch Data in Next.js using static and dynamic routes. If you like this video, make sure you hit thumbs up, subscribe, and click that little notification bell for future web dev content. Thanks for watching.